Sign in and send it if you are coming in. So good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? Appreciate you coming. So while the last person is signing in, not putting pressure so a couple of issues. First off, I want to let y'all know that we're being recorded so that we can send out video links next week. So before we're meeting, folks that couldn't be here, they'll actually be able to see the meeting. So when you have a question, please make sure you talk loudly so that we can capture it. The reporter's up there, it's being faced over here. So basically, the tone of silence is not right here. So project your voice when you have a question. On that note, Dr. Dwayne Freeze is awesomely come up here from the Indian River Lagoon to share his world experiences with us. I'm not going to introduce him much more than that because he knows himself so much better than I know him. But I did want to thank him very, very much for taking the time and to come up here and help us learn more about the S-Squared program so that when we have the opportunity, we're better educated, better positioned to hit home runs for these programs. One other housekeeping, you need to go to the restroom anytime. It's out this door. These two doors go to your right, and they're just down the hall on your right. We're going to have about a 2.5 hour meeting. Dwayne will be doing his presentations. We want to make this a conversation, so it's not just a talking head, because there's nothing that disturbs a video recording more than people snoring. So when you have questions, or as you have questions, please just raise your hand and ask a question. That way we're able to expand on topics as they come up, and you're not trying to remember a question till the end. So please let it be interactive. We want this to be as informative and worthwhile to you and your time. I also wanted to thank you for being here because everyone's busy. This is an extremely important topic for our communities, and appreciate you taking the time to invest in this. With that, is there anything else that you can think of, Dwayne, that I can cover? So with that, Dr. Dwayne Freeze, the Executive Director from the Indian River Lagoon National S-Squared Program.
Good morning, everybody. I'd rather be sitting down with you, but I'm being told that the mic is really good for audio, and they are streaming this. So I really do want to keep this as a conversation and to make sure that I'm giving you the kind of information you need. And so one of the things that I'd like to do is to take you through kind of almost a 4-step, are you hearing that reverb?
Turn that one off.
Is it on or off? Put us up
They may be interfering with each other.
Okay,
Okay, I'm going to
turn this on. You'll be able to hear me. I don't have trouble projecting, but it looks like they were just interfering with each other. So what I want to do is to actually take you through a 4-step story. And the story is about the Indian River Lagoon, but it could be anywhere in Florida or the nation for estuaries. And clearly, you all are dealing with, not just, how do you respond to the restore opportunity, and utilize those dollars most effectively, but also how do you look almost beyond restore? This is an opportunity to, right the wrong and invest dollars, and how do you best think about standing up an estuary program? And you have lots of options and lots of considerations, and there is no perfect way. So I want to talk about how we responded in the Indian River Lagoon. I want to talk about the strategic actions we're taking, and lastly, take you beyond restore, take you beyond even my program, how we look ahead to the future. And to do that, first you need to know a little bit about me, because I'm not your typical National Estuary Program Director. I've been there 15 months, and so in the whole scheme of 28 estuaries, I think I'm the oldest guy in the room most of the time. I did not come from government agency, I came from industry. And so my career was, one of those odd, circuitous pathways. I thought I was going to be a professor at a university. Instead, I took over Brevard County's Endangered Lands Program in the heyday of Preservation 2000. I was telling somebody the last time I was up here was several months before the Topsail Hill deal was closed. And George Wilson with the Nature Conservancy called me and said, "You got to come up. This is the most beautiful stretch of beach maybe in the world." And George didn't make those phone calls very often, and so I came up here and spent a couple days, and he was right, and so it's really good to be back. I left there and actually went to Hub SeaWorld Research Institute and was the executive director of science for a Florida expansion doing marine and ocean research. I left there and spent a year doing strategic planning for University of Central Florida, who was looking at the time to try to redefine their legendary sea turtle research program in the context of where do you go when their senior professor, Lou Earhart, retires. And so they are actually in that expansion now with a coastal program. Then went to industry, ran the senior science and business development side of a startup company that was doing nutrient remediation on Lake Jesup. And as that moved through, I literally thought I was getting ready to retire when this opportunity to restructure a national estuary program came up, and felt compelled by not just the pressure I was getting from friends and colleagues, but this sense that somehow we had an opportunity to do something really unique and different. And I think some of the lessons learned in these last 15 years may be useful to you. And so if you have a question, just raise your hand, we'll have a conversation. First though, you need to understand the Indian River Lagoon. Indian River Lagoon is 5 counties. We've got 45 cities. Each of those counties is uniquely different, as is each of those cities. But the connector is this estuary. It's a lagoonal system that has very little exchange with the ocean. And it might as well be 3 separate systems. We've got Mosquito Lagoon, Banana River Lagoon, Indian River Lagoon, but we also have this north, central, south regional context that make this one of the most biologically diverse systems in the world and one of the most vulnerable to impacts. And so the system itself looked fairly healthy, going from about 1986 to about 2007. And healthy in our world back then was really looking at seagrass expansion, water clarity. And so there was a general feeling that the lagoon was looking pretty good, that water quality was okay. We'd have our algal blooms now and then, but there wasn't a crisis, or so we thought. But there was some evidence that the scientists, in fact, back in 89 and 90, I had the luxury of actually helping then Governor Martinez write the technical document that brought this National Estuary Program to Florida. And I remember in that document, and I've pulled it out since I took this job, we made a case as scientists that coastal eutrophication was going to take us away from submerged aquatic vegetation and drive us into a microalgal system. And in fact, it took longer than we thought, but we are there now. And it happened really quickly. But there were some symptoms that we were seeing and maybe not urgently expressing concern over during this period of seagrass expansion. One of which was these catastrophic declines in some of our commercial fisheries. With clamming, there's no question that maybe overexploitation was part of that problem, but it was more than just that. The catch was on the reduction side. We were just not seeing the populations. The workload was getting harder and harder for our commercial fishers, to get the kinds of catches they had. And we also saw this expansion of drift algae and benthic macroalgae, which normally you see that as part of a normal estuary, but we were seeing large expansions. So we should have been looking more closely at the time to water quality parameters at the detail, some of these fisheries issues at the detail. But the fact is, in 2007, and this is all hypothesis, we had Tropical Storm Faye dumped a historic amount of rainfall, and you notice the seagrass trend started to change right after Tropical Storm Faye in 2008. And then we had, in 2009, 10, and 10 and 11, really intensely cold December, Januaries, where the macroalgal communities, literally disappeared quickly. And the hypothesis right now is that, this nutrient load background plus this collapse of that macroalgal community may have pushed us into a tipping point. And that tipping point is that in 2011, we had a algal bloom that was unprecedented in anything we had seen historically. And it began, in fact, now called the super bloom. And that algal super bloom, which was dominated by a lot of small plankton species that we hadn't seen before, dominated by picocyanobacteria, tiny little green algae, and then transitioning in 2012, 2013 into the Texas brown tide, which we had never seen before. We didn't know it existed in the lagoon. And you can see from this trend, we have been in almost continuous bloom since 2011, with the ultimate outcome of those blooms and the loss of water clarity and quality is about a 60% loss of seagrasses. And so we are in a system that changed really rapidly before our eyes. We had, during the 2011 to 13, we had mortality events, unusual marine mammal mortalities. Manatees, of course, shifted their diet from seagrasses to macroalgae, and there were all sorts of dietary issues there. And so the citizenry started to really look closely at the challenges that we were under. And even though we had all the partners at the table, we had a good partnership within the existing National Estuary Program, there was growing concern and a growing voice from the local constituents, from the counties and from the cities, that they wanted a greater engagement, a greater conversation. Along this same period, we've had some pretty intense fish kills. So the last was a year ago, really, March, where we've had the largest fish kill ever recorded, including world-class trophy fish. And simultaneously, in that period of 2016, and I'm sure you've all heard about this in the news, we've had these episodic discharges from Lake Okeechobee west of the Caloosahatchee and east down through the St. Lucie estuary to the southern Indian River Lagoon that created, in this past year, one of the most intense toxic cyanobacterial blooms I've ever seen. There were, and you can see in this lower right-hand corner, we had algal mats in certain areas of the southern lagoon that were every bit of 6 to 12 inches thick, and it was breaking up almost like an ice floe. This was not just an ecological challenge and disaster, but it was an economic disaster, much like what you all felt during the oil spill. But it was also a human health threat. And so these toxins can be dangerous to both pets, humans, as well as wildlife. And there were recordings of cyanotoxins that were 1,000 times what the World Health Standards are. And this lasted for months. And so there's a sense of urgency building in our communities through that 2011 to 2014-15, this feeling like we needed to do something different, that we needed to rethink this 25-year National Estuary Program, and working together with partners and working together with all of the agencies, federal, state, local, citizens, a discussion began. And part of that discussion is thinking about how you do business differently. Even when you're successful, you constantly need to be thinking about how can you do this better, cheaper, more efficiently? How can you look, at the tactical side of what you need to do today and the long-range side of how do you sustain this over long periods? It doesn't surprise me, but it was really interesting yesterday because I went to the, both meetings, the directors meeting yesterday and the Gulf Consortium meeting. And gosh, 6 years seems like such a long time. And at the same time, gosh, it doesn't seem that long ago when we had this problem. But all of these federal programs take a while to move and to set up. And so what I wanted to do was to give you a sense now of how we did it, what we were thinking about. Daryl.
Yeah, I'm reading the slide, so I grew up here, and my folks moved to Fort Walton in '67. And I remember as a kid that we used to have those fish kill pictures that you showed. I mean, we used to have that in Pensacola Bay. You knew it was summer, but all the fish kills. And we've done a lot to improve that. And I just love the quote there because I think that's one of the reasons that the estuary program is so important to us. I didn't want to cut your line of thought, but I just wanted to try to start the conversation.
I want you to cut the line of thought. I want this to be a discussion, not a lecture.
It's a really good point, though, where for those of us that have been here for a long time, we have seen really the Pensacola area in particular, that's what I can speak to, that's where I grew up, of those fish kills. And your throat burning from the air quality. And we've gotten a lot better due to in large part, of a lot of people in this room. And I think we have an opportunity now with creating the estuary programs to sort of not rest on our laurels and don't get comfortable and really get the local governments engaged in the conversation of what do we need to do, particularly with this money that we have a chance to make it right, so to speak. So I just really, yes, sir.
Why weren't you warned about water quality data?
The water quality data, the warning was our nutrient loads were up. And here's a piece of advice that I wish we had, because part of the reason I took this job was because I felt like we had made a mistake, that we did not, as urgently as we should have, respond to the things we knew were coming. So we knew we had 300,000 septic tanks, and we knew they contribute nitrogen to ground and sometimes groundwater. We knew we had aging infrastructure. We knew we had this massively growing population. And so we, predicted that this would be the pathway. But like, I think, just human nature, we respond more urgently to crisis than we do to long-term planning. And so, part of my message to you now is with the Restore money, you have this unique historic opportunity to actually envision, even beyond the projects and the dollars, as to how you want this region to grow. And I'm going to show you, or at least share some ideas with you on, some things to think about as you move forward. But we know that we need to put all these estuaries, are suffering from nutrient over-enrichment. You're always going to have, algal blooms. In fact, they're natural at times, but when you have 6-8 months constant blooms, there's a difference between the normal cycling of an estuary and the human-induced transition from a healthy estuary to one that won't sustain the kinds of activities that we want. Fishing, swimming, and I'll mention this later, but commercial fishing to me is that's the high bar. When we have robust commercial fisheries that are working sustainably, we know we've gotten the water quality right. But we probably should have been way more aggressive in sounding the alarm on those subtle, incremental pieces of evidence, but we weren't. And it's something we shouldn't repeat that mistake ever again. Other questions? So this was the transition of thought, and it was interesting. You know, we were 25 years in a water management district with a tremendously successful program. It's part of the discussion we're going to have today about how do you host. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And the state, the federal government, the local constituencies started to have this conversation beginning in 2011-12 about we need to get in front of this problem. It's really bad, and it's impacting lives and property values, and in fact, whole economies. And so the counties formed a collaborative in 2013, which for me was, and I was in industry then, I thought, this is it. This was the thing that we really wanted 25 years ago that never quite materialized, where the local governments were taking leadership action and working together, having a conversation, 5 counties, about how they could lead the effort along with their state, regional, and federal partners. And, it had always been kind of top down instead of bottom up. And this was the beginning of a transformational change in thought and also leadership. The Indian River Lagoon Council was created as a result of those discussions. And we were created as an independent special district of the state of Florida. We do not have taxing authority. We do not have regulatory authority. This special district was stood up for a single purpose, and that is to host the National Estuary Program, and then to restructure that program to this new ecological reality that we're dealing with. And so 2015, we put that interlocal agreement together. In fact, one of the counties decided not to join at the time. For a number of different reasons, and 3 cities within that county formed their own interlocal and came on board on behalf of that county. And in fact, next Friday, that county will be joining, and we'll move forward with 5 counties. But think about 5 counties, 45 cities, very similar to what you have here on the Panhandle. We've got everybody at the table now, federal, state, local, regional, with representation. However, I got hired on day 1 where this program first became official. So checks started coming in from the partners, in September of 15. My start date was October 1 of 2015 because we were an existing NEP. We actually inherited the contracts that the Water Management District had. So we had a couple of immediate and very important administrative functions to deal with. Besides me finding an office, finding staff, we had contracts that were already supposed to have started on October 1st that were still in negotiation. So all of those assets came over. I hired staff, but we still had to petition the EPA to become the formal host of the National Estuary Program. And those of you in the counties who are working with the federal government, you know how slow that process can be at times. I can tell you the EPA was amazing in this. We were told 6 months to a year to make that transition. I came in being stupid and naive from industry and said, let's do it in 90 days. And, everybody said that'll never happen. And in fact, in about the 95th day, the EPA designated us as the host that first month of January of 2016. So you can imagine, we've got this brand new program. I hired my first staff member, in December, the second in January. And in December was when those algal blooms of 2015, 2016 started. Lake Okeechobee discharges started in January. And so we hit the road thinking we were going to be focused this first year on, restoration and, thinking the big picture of how the structure of this organization and reorganization goes. And we were in emergency mode for every bit of 8 months, where we were doing the business of reorganization and the business of responding to what was a crisis in the system lagoon-wide. And so, yes.
I'm sorry.
No, feel free.
If you could talk a little bit more about the council, the structure of the council, is it like a board of directors?
I'm going to show you exactly. I'm going to lay this out in, I'm not going to go in the weeds today except for that, because I know you're thinking about how do you organize. So I'm going to spend a good part of this about what our structure looks like and how you think about your options as you structure estuary programs. I think there's a lot of information that you can glean from the National Estuary Program. It is successful beyond almost any program in the nation because it's had really strong roots in being non-regulatory, consensus-building, local community-driven, science-driven, and most importantly, that the federal government kind of stands back. It's not oversight from the top down. They provide that backbone, that framework to discuss these issues of not just local, state, or regional importance, but that each one of these assets, every single one of these estuaries, is an asset in a national portfolio of estuaries. And so there are ways that we can communicate within that network, both the best management practices. So the model of the NEPs is a good model for you to look at. The National Estuarine Research Reserves gives you another look from a different perspective, kind of on the research and education. So, and I'll mention this again later, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. There's some really good programs, and between your partnerships with DEP, the water management districts, you have a lot of really good practices to choose from. We had very clear goals, and I'm going to mention this in a little bit too. Coming from industry and having done some reorganization, the first thing I look for is vision. And when you have really good goals, that's one thing, but you need to have an aspirational vision of where you're taking this business. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit too. But the goals were clear and broad, and I think almost at the level of vision. So you wanted to have a healthy ecosystem, healthy communities and economies around that ecosystem, and you wanted to make sure that it was going to last, through the stewardship years, that this isn't a project, but it is a long view of a water and estuarine infrastructure that impacts coastal communities nationwide. And you wanted projects, and this was a real clear directive. We wanted to leverage dollars, leverage expertise, deliver projects that had high return on investment value. So the challenge I had when I came on board was, what does that structure look like? And having been around the NEP for 25 years, I had to almost slap myself and say, okay, don't look at what you did before. Let's look at the normal structure of an NEP and see if we can't fine-tune it for the moment with some different considerations to make it better and more efficient. And so our management structure, and I heard some conversation in the meetings yesterday, especially with the coordinators, do you build your project list at a staff level? Do you bring the public in? That is always going to be kind of the challenge of estuary governance. Public participation is absolutely essential, but there are certain parts of the business that sometimes you have to move forward and then bring it to the public for review once you've got the best science. And so the council is the policy board for our National Estuary Program. And I'll show you how that's structured, but those individual agencies on the council came with money, signed the interlocal agreement, and sign the bylaws, on where this program would go. So that's our executive committee. The management board in the past had been a suite of volunteers that were agency-driven, but very often not on-the-ground managers, maybe not fully distributed evenly throughout the range of that 156-mile lagoon. So we have about 37 management board members with broad representation. All of those management board members were appointed by that executive committee. So the policy council appointed those members. One of the things they did at my request, and I was very pleased that they did, is when we looked at our science, technology, engineering, and modeling group, the scientists, and that historically had been really good scientists from different disciplines, at least in the beginning, and then over years, it was almost like a distance. The longer you had to drive, the sooner they weren't showing up for the meetings. And so when I looked at science, I thought there is where we need to do something totally different. So we restructured the science committee in a totally different way, which I'll show you in a second. Citizens Advisory Committee in the past had been really well-meaning, smart, fully committed environmental groups, and we felt this needs to be broader, needed to be geographic, needed to have multiple players, needed to be diverse. We needed to have the diversity of those cities and counties. So the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council came in as representatives of the cities. And you notice in this that we've got the Sunshine Circle. Part of the challenge that we saw, we wanted to very clearly work in Sunshine, be transparent, make sure everything was noticed. And in fact, we do that even when we're kind of outside of that circle. But we also knew that you have to let scientists have a conversation. You need to let staff members, your staff, if you're county employees, you can't be inhibited from making a phone call to your neighboring county to say, what the heck's going on with the water quality? What are your numbers looking like? So a lot of individuals who we would have normally placed inside the appointment committees, we left outside. And they funnel through those appointees. So we made sure that we weren't hamstringing the ability for open communication where you need it. So you'll see how this stepped down here in a second. So our council, the EPA decided that they did not want to vote, that they were going to be, advisory only, but they sit and advise the council. We have direct representation from Department of Environmental Protection, St. John's and South Florida Water Management Districts, 4 of the 5 counties initially, and as of next week it will be all 5 counties, and 5 of those members, they are all locally elected officials, and they are basically appointed by those individual commissions or committees. They are the final say. And then the management board is advisory to that council. And while a lot of people said, Dwayne, you're never going to be able to manage the kind of size. We're looking at over 100 people in our management conference. The fact is, this isn't about structure. And if I can leave you with one thought today, it's easy to get so preoccupied about the perfect structure that you don't think about the function and the culture. So this is about getting the right people in the room and knowing that you're going to have people who are busy. You want to make sure that this is a representative governance model. And we'll talk about that. So we've got the kind of on-the-ground managers, a number of staffers, but we've left a lot of people off the table so agencies can be represented. So I wanted the Corps of Engineers on the management board. And when I talked to the Corps, they said, we'd rather be on the outside. And we'll work closely with you as staff to bring our issues to the table. National Park Service, who really needs to be in that management board because of some of their internal policies, it's difficult for them to serve in official capacity. And so these are conversational structures, but not functional. This is what the scientists, and I have to tell you, I had a few scientists who were not too happy with me when I unveiled this for the first time. Because we had universities with really incredible individuals who spent decades seated on our technical advisory committee at the time who are no longer seated. And I had to make phone calls and say, this is a different way of doing business. And so what we did is that we reached out to the 22, 23, 24 entities out there, academic institutions, research institutions. We set up a special line for, the private contractor. We even set up a special line for the retired scientist who was no longer affiliated with a university or a research entity because, they've got the knowledge. And gosh, we're all getting a little older. You don't want that knowledge to disappear. And we said 1 vote per entity. And so what this did was change the dynamic. So you weren't empowering individuals or special disciplines. We were empowering organizational involvement. So University of Central Florida has now almost 36 scientists, social scientists, and engineers who have formed a coastal cluster. I have access to all 36. Their representative, her job is to make sure whatever we do, those 36 individuals understand, know, and are engaging. And I'll let you know how this works. I mean, we're literally only in the first year of this, and we're trying to pick through that cultural component. Because any of you from universities? Well, you know, those of you who know, if I'm over in the engineering college and I've got somebody over in, you know, the College of Sciences, and I've got the, you know, statistician and the economist over in business, they're not talking to each other ever. And so we're trying to force change, not just in the NEP, but we're actually trying to force change within some of those partner institutions. So we have multidisciplinary conversations where science is not just working in a vacuum. You've got the social scientists, even the cultural scientists working with us. And so the word is still out on that, but you'll notice to the right of this, we left all of the kind of the staff people in local government who have to have full access. They have the ability to talk. All those scientists have the ability to talk openly. The only sunshine implication is on those 24 individuals who are appointed to represent their constituencies. I think this is a really good model. We'll see how well it works, because it really puts a lot of responsibility on that individual to be a network node for communication and information. And we're working through that right now. Over on the citizen side, this was like the most fun for me. We have always had, and I'm sure you guys don't have it, where you look east and west from your county or your city and you say, they're getting all the money or they're getting all the notoriety. Well, in the Indian River Lagoon, that was really intense. That northern lagoon, southern lagoon disconnect is economic, it's social, it's historic, and we branded a line that actually gets rolled out officially a week from today. One lagoon, one community, one voice. That we can maintain our independent interests and our special interests in our communities, but the lagoon is going to be the one thing that connects us all and connects our futures. And so what we did is we appointed individuals who are ambassadors in each of those 5 counties. And now we do our meetings. We're just starting that next month. Each of those counties, we're taking the meetings to the county instead of having those individuals drive 50, 60 miles to some government building in order to have a conversation. And we've empowered them in a way that I'll show you in a minute. So they're super excited. They actually have some work to do. So that's the structure. But there was one thing missing, yeah.
Yeah, can I poke a little bit on that? So I think you said you had 40-something folks on the management council, and it looked like there was...
Oh, there's over 100 people in what we call the National Estuary Program, and I'm sure you guys are starting to get it, as you talk to the federal people. There's language, so if you're talking to the Treasury folks, they have a language. The EPA has a language. In the National Estuary Program language, that community, the council, the management board, the Science, Technology, Engineering Advisory Committee, the Citizens Advisory Committee is called the Management Conference. And it really is. It's a conference. It's where we confer about problems, solutions, funding.
So you had like 9...
It's like over 100 people in the conference in total.
But the policy was like 9, is that right?
9 with 8 voting members.
Okay, and then I think you said 40-something as far as...
It's about 36 in the management board, and then we've got 24 in the Science, Technology, Engineering modeling group, and then we've got, I think, 21, 22, if I count them up, 4 to 5 each in the counties. Okay. And we're open to actually increase that should they desire more representation.
So you said that the management board were all appointed by the policy.
So all of these were ultimately appointed. I'm glad you brought that up. I started down that track. I asked the council to let me set up the scientists because I know them all. I've worked with them for 25 years. And they gave me that authority to go find the right people in those right places in order, to get that where the structure and the function was going to work, and then bring that back to them. Normally they had appointment authority. They divested that authority to me to go put the right scientists in the right places.
So on the management did each policy board member appoint 4, or?
Yeah, we distributed it across the board, so they each got 4 or 5 appointments. We helped guide them, where they had questions. So it was even representation.
And then on the STEM, I love this versus the science advisory. I love the STEM.
Well, there's a whole story behind that. If we have time, we can talk about it. I never thought having a science advisory board would get an engineer mad, but it does.
I like that. And so I'm assuming, so what I heard you say is that you kind of brought recommendations to the policy board on who should be on that technical advice or the STEM committee, and then they would basically approve it, or?
That's correct. And what we do now, so every decision we make gets vetted through that conference. And so next week, I'll have my management board meeting before I have the council meeting. And so we've got an audit coming up. We have the rollout of our new brand, just beginning the comprehensive conservation management plan. That goes through the science committee, through the citizens, up into the management board, ultimately for policy decision making at the policy board, which is the council. And it's time consuming, and it's a lot of management of both people, and it does slow the process down, there's no question. But what it does do is that when I finally get to those 8 voting members, 5 of which are elected officials, it's not about what Dwayne wants or about some view of the world that my staff and I think. We have fully vetted this in an arena that's been open. All these meetings are, open to the public under the sunshine. And so it's fully vetted and peer reviewed before it hits that policy board. And, there's some inefficiencies, but we're getting better and better at being able to move information through that network. And I think it's a really good model because public is engaged. They have public opportunities to speak, in advance, early in the meeting and later. And plus everything is on our website, and we're just ready to roll out a new website. And so even when we do review documents, we just completed our 5-year program evaluation from EPA, which is every bit of 90 days of work for a whole team. Before we even submitted it to EPA, we just popped it on the website and then submitted it. So people have it, they see us. We're not hiding anything, everything. This is about the public, it's their program. And this won't sustain without that local citizen engagement and support. Yes?
So Dwayne, what would you suggest is sort of the time period for going, I guess, from the point of having a council to having a fully functional set of committees?
Well, I can tell you what our time period is. We began this effort October 1, 15. Because we didn't have the NEP officially, we couldn't really officially start this process, although we did start, a lot of the discussions about it. We didn't fully seat the Citizens Advisory Committee. It was about a year. But, we could have done it faster. We just felt that letting it mature a little bit, it was such a big, after 25 years, when you change something, you've got a lot of people concerned about where you're headed. We took our time with this because we knew that we had so much administrative work to do that to bring all of this up really quickly was likely going to, hurt us down the line because we didn't make the right people decisions. So it was a good bit of a year. And remember, we're already seeing transitions. So 2 of my council members are already, didn't run for election, and so we're already seeing turnover. And that's the other side of having a little bit of size, that you get a little stability in the size of the network. And also in each of those counties, and this is not a negative statement, it's just a true statement, that some of the best knowledge is not seated in your elected officials. It's in the staff who work for those elected officials. So making sure that you've got a place for that long-standing scientific community, the staffers, and then you've got kind of that information flow. You don't lose the historic nature of understanding a system and its change, because that historic perspective, if you lose that, you're going to have a hard time, running an estuary program, because you got to know where you're headed, but you also want to know what it looked like 20 years ago, and so that Having the emeritus professors, in that line of STEM was really important. Now, it's really hard to get them off the golf course sometimes to help. But the fact is, we want them to, at least on the last view, say, yeah, this makes sense. And this is what we were thinking 40, 50 years ago. But it's a good part of the year, and you shouldn't rush it, but you need to be thinking about that transition from structure to function, kind of almost at the very beginning of where you're going. And this is not the perfect structure for everybody. It just happened to work for us, we think. Yes?
Yeah, first point, thanks for making the trip up. I think everybody here really appreciates it. The committees, how do you keep them engaged?
That is a tough thing. And so we made a decision at the staff level, and I'll show you kind of the rest of this in a minute, that meetings for meeting's sake simply was not going to happen ever again with us. And having these meetings where staff spends 2/3 of the meeting telling you what staff did, that wasn't going to happen either. That these committees need to be taking action at the levels of their expertise and at the levels that they want to participate, so their areas of interest. And so what we're doing now is that we are driving aspects of our program and empowering those committees to take charge. So we created a finance subcommittee within the management board, and anything financial, we're vetting through them first before we take it to the policy board. The management committee is fully engaged in our comprehensive conservation management plan process. And I want to talk about that in a little bit, because that's where the rubber hits the road for an NEP, is getting a full comprehensive plan in place that everybody buys off on. The challenge for me was the Citizens Advisory Committee. How do you keep, citizens who have kids, who have jobs, who have families engaged in a process that very often looks bureaucratic, very often is bureaucratic? I mean, how do you actually make that work? And so we have just recently decided to take a certain revenue share that we have and make a small grants program, and they're going to administer that small grants program. They helped us write the RFP. They're going to help us review those proposals. We're going to do that county by county, so they actually see where the rubber hits the road. But engagement is really important. Those of you who have been 6 years with Restore, you're probably going, God, when are we going to do a project? When are we going to finally turn dirt? When are we going to see money flowing? And you're at that point, but some of this takes some time, and you'll have moments in the history of these programs where you'll have lulls, and you need to be thinking about how to keep people at the table, not just engaged, but excited ambassadors of the engagement. And I'm going to give you some suggestions on how to do that in a minute.
Yeah, I know you want to get to the next slide.
No, I'm good.
This question, I think, is really a good one now. That's one of the things that we keep hearing, and personally I think we all struggle with, which is planning versus action. And there was another planning exercise. So if you could just maybe dig in a little bit deeper as to, so why an escrow program? Why not just put the money into turning dirt? What's the extra lift we're going to get as a community by investing the time and effort to create an escrow program versus taking that same time and energy to just picking a project and turning dirt?
Let me start that, because I'm going to hit that kind of almost as a theme in the back half of this, but it is the most important question. You have to ask yourself, how do you move forward as a community, not just in the context of Restore Act projects, but how do you actually move a community forward where your environmental, economic, quality of life issues all come together? The planning component of that is absolutely essential. You will never get to some end game, some envisionary goal, unless you have a plan to get there. And that plan does not have to be 1,000 pages. It could be 5 pages. But to try to move large-scale evolution of communities without a plan is like starting a business without a plan. And I use this analogy a lot, but you need to have a vision why you're even starting this business in the first place. You need to have goals for that vision. What are your expected, and this is a terminology you'll see in a minute. EPA uses it. I didn't like it at first. Now I'm starting to love it. What are your outputs, your deliverables? What are your outcomes, short, medium, and long term? What is your expectation? How do those individual components come together where you get synergy of value? The one thing I didn't say about myself is I serve Governor Scott as a board member. I'm a board of director on CareerSource Florida. And so I'm on the environmental side, but I'm also on the job creation side. I see so many opportunities for synergy between an estuary program and economic development that are not normally talked about. I see opportunities for infrastructure, new ways of doing infrastructure, including clean technology development that fits perfectly with where our communities in Florida need to go, and an estuary program. I just saw some data. I tried to get the graph because it was shocking to me. It was a hotspot map of the state of Florida, county by county, done by the Florida Chamber Foundation on job growth or loss since 2007. You know, the hotter red was loss. You know, the green, the darker green was gain. And I was stunned about how many counties still have job loss and how much that's concentrated, not just in the Panhandle, but in rural Florida in general. You know, we can't have that if the state's going to prosper. And so we've got to figure out a way to make this strategic planning for ecosystem health and sustainability. It's got to dovetail with the human, built environment. And if we do that well, this state has a really incredible future. If we do it badly, then you'll see exactly what happened in Brevard and St. Lucie and Martin County last year. On the St. Lucie River, during that cyanobacterial bloom, there were reports that million-dollar properties lost 30% of their value. That value has not been recovered. And in fact, now there's a disclosure issue. Do you have to disclose if you're selling a property that in all likelihood the next discharge from Lake Okeechobee, is going to impact water quality and human health? So these are all connected. So planning is absolutely essential. So here are three things I hear on the street, and they're the three things I hate the most. And I just heard it in Tallahassee last week and yesterday. We don't need any more science. We know all the science, let's do shovel-ready turn dirt. Science and knowledge is the pathway to do turn dirt projects faster, cheaper, and better. When John Glenn first went into orbit, nobody was screaming, we don't need to do any more science, we just got a human into orbit. Research and development are absolutely critical to good infrastructure development, and water is an infrastructure issue. Number two is this idea that bigger is always better. And we had a good discussion, and I agree that for those of you who are trying to look at how you manage your restore dollars, that there is an administrative cost that after a while there's a break point between, do you do 20, 30 tiny little projects, or do you do two really big ones? And I'll suggest that it's not about the number of projects, it's about your outcomes from those projects. So in my, counties, they're talking about let's commoditize the value of a project, a return on investment value on the cost, for example, the cost per pound of nitrogen reduced. And I really like that, but it can't be the only commodity value, because if we did it just on that issue alone, we'd never do a stormwater baffle box ever again. Because one baffle box doesn't give you a good return on investment on $1 per pound. But if you have 100,000 needs for baffle boxes and you add up all that nitrogen coming off the roads, you've got a really good outcome. And so you need to be thinking about kind of the big picture of outputs, outcomes, and what are your goals. And the third is one that probably concerns me the most, this general tendency to not want to fund citizen education and engagement. Those numbers have been steadily going down through all of our programs, this tendency about let somebody else do the education. And I will tell you from firsthand knowledge, even in this 15 months, if your programs are not fully committed to engaging your citizenry, educating your citizenry, especially communicating the value of your program to those citizens, then you will not have the support for that program. So it's a disconnect. I'm all for shovel ready, turn dirt. And in fact, you'll see we structured our program to handle all three. And when you have an urgent need, you want to move as fast as you can to remediation and restoration, but you can't leave those other legs of the stool, off the table on planning. Otherwise, you will have an uneven delivery system of a business, and you won't be sustainable over the long haul. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because I'll give you some suggestions about planning. Planning does not have to be onerous, although the federal government makes it pretty complicated. And I'm going to show you how we're going to at least attack that issue with our comprehensive plan. Let me back up one. I want to show you this just as an example of where we forget to partner. Looking back at the 25 years of the National Estuary Program, we always had really good indirect support from the whole community, including the business community, but they weren't directly engaged. Partly because if you're in private sector business, small business, you're too busy to spend time sitting at meetings. And so what we did is we created a special network. It's called the Innovator and Investor Network. It was specifically addressed to industries and businesses that wanted to get involved at some level, but they would decide how, whether it was direct cash, whether it was in kind. And I just want to give you two quick examples about how profoundly successful that was. I thought it was going to take 3 years to get this off the ground. The very first entrant into the IRL I-Square group was Port Canaveral with a check for $100,000. And what was driving them was a very important recognition that, how do we get citizens to become more lagoon friendly? Education doesn't seem to be working, so they're still fertilizing. They're still using herbicides and pesticides on waterfront properties. We still are picking up litter every single weekend on our beaches. How do you change education to actually empower behavior change? So we are doing a $50,000 study with a professor at University of Florida, Martha Monroe, to ask that very question, but that was public-privately funded. Harris Corporation invited me into their aviation and aerospace innovation team and allowed me to do a reverse pitch, which is like a Shark Tank in reverse. I've never done one of those, but I had 350 engineers and scientists nationwide, 110 in a room, and I was allowed to pitch some big ideas. Stuff like, if I had 1 billion gallons of water coming out of Lake Okeechobee a day, how could you treat that on a single pass where there's no nutrient, no phosphorus, no organic pollutant loads? We didn't get the answer to that one, but we did get a really incredible suite of ideas, 66 in fact, from their scientists around the nation about how do you do remote sensing and monitoring cheaper, faster, and better. And then we did reverse Shark Tanks, and they are now down to a single project which looks like Harris Corporation will be funding and may have some funding from the Florida High-Tech Corridor Council. So there are places for industry. Don't forget industry when you're standing up these estuary programs. They need to come to you. You can't force them in because a lot of industries are nervous about, government programs and regulatory issues. But you can see, in less than 6 months now, we are starting to build a partnership here, one of which was something that happened in the parking lot this morning before I came in. One of the wealthiest communities along the Indian River Lagoon has decided that they want to invest, and they want to know where that community can kind of almost embrace a project where they would fund it individually with their homeowners group. I mean, that's something I've never heard before. And so you just have to open those doors. Staff support, we're operating lean. You need to think about that early on. Because the other thing I hear is, we want to keep administrative costs low. We don't want to see government bloated. We don't want to start a whole new layer of government. And I'm going to put my industrial hat back on. You can't run a business without people. And you can't run a good business without hiring the very best people you can find. And while we're operating right now among the smallest national estuary programs staff-wide in the country, the smallest is 3, and by far we're not the smallest geographically or in complexity. This is not a sustainable delivery of staff. We'll last for a little while, and I think we're doing really remarkable things. And I keep telling my staff, hang in, this will change in a while, but I kind of like the fact that we are lean and mean like an industry startup would be. And it may be that I'm not the right guy for the organic growth. So my contract's 3 years, but I hired 2 of the best people I could find who actually knew about national estuary programs. So I didn't have to retrain somebody on NEPORT and federal reporting and treasury issues. And those people are out there, and so you need to look at the skill sets you need to deliver a project that's scaled at an appropriate size. And because of the real heavy concern among the council about being administratively overweighted, we actually outsourced our legal and our financial. And so we brought in one of the best legal teams on special districts that we could find, Carolyn Yancey, who used to be a senior attorney for South Florida Water Management District. And we brought in Special District Services, a financial team who administers special districts, and combined we're paying them less than $100,000 a year on these contracts, and we're getting the power of full service that we could never have done with staff. And in fact, if we had hired an attorney and a CPA, we would be well over $100,000 in our expenditures if you look at, benefits and all the other issues. So there are ways to do this. So this is what our revenue stream looks like. Yeah, go ahead. No.
So going back to the previous slide, so I understand the executive director position. You're chief operating officer. Can you expand on
Sure. When I first came in, coming from industry, I said, I'm not hiring anybody who's had any contact with the old NEP. God, I had dope. I mean, that was such a bad thought process. But I thought, well, we're starting a new organization. We're going to start fresh. And so literally hours after my interview, Frank Sakuma, my chief operating officer, called me up and he goes, I really want to work for this program. I love this program. I'm invested in it. Anything that you need, and he was still with St. Johns River Water Management District, whatever you need, I will deliver. And so I started to call on him repeatedly, and the Water Management District and DEP, they were so helpful in this transition. I can't tell you, we would never have gotten there without support of those agencies. But I started to look at the skill sets that this individual had and went, I'm sole sourcing this. I'll take the heat if somebody wants to make the case that I should go competitive. There was no way that I was going to, in a competitive situation, be able to take somebody who already knew the contracts. And we had to bring, I think it was 13 or 14 contracts from the district over to us. He was already doing the contracting. He was already doing the scope of work. He was right in the middle. So I hired him as a chief operating officer. He does everything contract management, everything. He knew NEPORT and all of the federal reporting procedures, and they are really complicated. And so I brought him in, and it was just like having a second CEO with an internal operational capacity that simply I didn't have the skill sets to bring. And that allowed me to go out and build this coalition. And then I did a competitive search for a combined need. I knew I needed an administrative assistant for all of us, but I needed somebody who had way more skills. So I went the other direction and hired the best communication education person I knew, who could also do contract management. And that was a competitive search. And in fact, Kathy Hill, who many of you who have been in the game probably have met Kathy before, also was she was a contractor for the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. And there was no question I hired her, after that competitive review. She was head and shoulders above the other candidates. And I just sat back and I just learned an executive decision lesson, and that is, don't be pedantic about where you think you're going when it comes to people and leadership and experience. Just get the best people you can find. And I did. And I'm up here able to talk to you today because I have those two people running the show down there.
And so one thing that we've been trying to figure out what would a core team be, and the only other position that we have sort of on our list that I don't see up there is a lead scientist. And so how does that...
That's an awesome question. This is not the way I would have structured this program administratively, but understanding the interests, strong interests of the council, I basically stood down on having a senior scientist. You need to have a senior scientist. The executive director, even though they're expecting me to be that, cannot be the executive director, the senior scientist, oh, and by the way, the lobbyist. That simply does not work. I can do it for this 3-year contract that I have in transition, partly because, I've done this. I'm, a senior executive. I know how to juggle a lot of issues, but it is not sustainable over the long haul. Somebody has to engage that scientific community. Right now, it's me, but you need to have somebody of scientific skills. And I would recommend not just the best scientists but the best scientist communicator that you can find. Somebody who can walk into a room, in a t-shirt and blue jeans and have a conversation with anybody in the community, and not somebody who's kind of carrying the ivory tower. In fact, you were probably surprised. I was coming in blue jeans. My plan was, I was up in Tallahassee and coming out of one of the hearings, I overheard somebody say, God, look at that. I've never seen so many frowns and so many blue suits in a room except for a funeral. I think these people probably have never been on the water on the Indian River Lagoon before. And I'm looking down and I'm in a full blue suit and I'm thinking, so I almost dressed down for you all today. I'm sorry I didn't. But yeah, you need to have people, who can work together as a team but work with community. This is not about the National Estuary Program or about your estuary program. The estuary program is a program that serves the people and serves the estuary and the coastal areas. And so these cannot operate somehow as some ivory tower office or bureaucracy. You got to be on the street talking to the people who are doing the work and who are impacted by that work. Yes?
Well, I'm not sure if I maybe should just wait for the rest of your talk, but of these people, who's generating new revenue or going out and finding new contracts and new sources of funding to fulfill your plan, or are you at that stage yet?
We are just getting to that stage. That, for the most part, is me right at the moment. And so this is our revenue, and compared to the monies that you all are considering with Restore, it looks small, but to be honest, even small projects, when you have long-term commitment to funding, those start to synergize in ways that can be profoundly important. Even knowing that, this is just a part of the partnership. We've got tremendous projects with both water management districts. We have great projects with DEP, with Fish and Wildlife. And so it isn't about one program. It's about how those programs all interact so you don't have overlap and waste, and that you're leveraging the power of that partnership. And Darryl, you mentioned, what's the power of an NEP or an estuary program? It's that. This is the place where you get to coordinate. It's almost like being the choreographer of a ballet is the best. You're not doing the music most of the time. You're not doing the sets. Clearly, you're not the dancer. But somebody needs to put this all in the proper framework so you get to where you're going, whether it's local, regional, or state. And so this is our operational budget. We get some license plate revenues. The new revenue generation will be through chasing grants, proposals, donations, and that'll be through the Innovator Investor Group, which is less than a year old. And in less than a year, we've probably generated it's just a little over $100,000 in cash and thousands of dollars of in-kind. So the key is you want to, when you have money, you still should be looking for money. And we need to talk about that before we end today, because I see a challenge for you all as you move through Restore, kind of looking down the line of where you are after those funds ultimately stop. And it seems like a long way off, but you need to start planning right at the beginning, the structure of sustainability. So what we did was partition. Yes?
So is your NEP supported through NOAA, through the national programs, and longer lived than the 5-year proposed estuary program that will be coming to our area?
The answer is national estuary programs are unique in that those 28 estuaries have been designated by Congress as estuaries of national significance. So we are part of the core water program, but that doesn't mean that you can guarantee the money is coming. In fact, we're fighting right now along with a lot of other agencies. You know, we get our money from EPA. So if you look at this diagram, you know, we get about $600,000 a year through EPA on Section 320. Those are the broad dollars. And because our local partners are very much interested in shovel-ready turn dirt, what we're doing is we're pulling science and some of the citizen engagement and the planning out of the EPA portion of the dollars, which is exactly what they see as a priority focus. We're taking the local cost share dollars and driving those dollars into projects. And you have to be careful. You cannot do a large construction project without planning. And so, you know, those project plans, you know, how fast can you get them to 30%? How fast can you get them through permitting and into construction? There's a time lag there. And so all of these programs will succeed or fail based on the money that comes in. And even when you don't have a lot of money like us, having the ability to count on those dollars year to year allow you to really build high value, high return on investment for both the estuary and the community. And so we took the member contributions straight to projects, but we look for match on those projects. So we want those partners coming in with matching dollars, and then the amount of match will help on the ranking of those projects, and we rank them all through the conference. And then in the past, the specialty license plate dollars, we kind of just roll that into the general, and we're using those dollars now for the small grants, anything from $2,500 to $10,000. You know, sure, they're not going to change the game of an estuary, but it puts the ability of those citizens to actually see lots of incremental progress, whether it's a small oyster mat project or a living shoreline component or even a piece of signage. You know, those dollars are hard to find, and we have a lot of partners, you know, struggling to move those incremental pieces. So we'll see how that works. This will be the first year. Our RFPs hit the street in about 2 weeks on our 17-18 budget. It'll be 5 separate RFPs and 1 RFQ. Where we actually leverage dollars in a significant way, in fact, I wish I had brought that, I'll send it to Darrell, is we spend about $60,000 a year on a contractor to help the local governments write proposals. And that's part of the EPA guidance that, you know, part of what we're supposed to do is provide technical assistance and support. And every year, that's a competitive award. Every year for 25 years, the same firm has won it. But the return on investment has been phenomenal. I think the worst year in the last 25, a $60,000 investment brought like $3 million back. And some of the big years, it's over $10 million. And with a success rate of well over 85%. And the local governments, especially small cities who don't have staff to go chase these grants, that is a really profoundly important place. Even though it's not a turn dirt project, it's not kind of traditional, that has provided tremendous value to the point that this year our council and our management conference said, let's put more money. So they took that 60 grand and brought it to 80 because of the return on investment value. And in fact, a number of those projects that are legislative budget requests in Tallahassee, are still alive only because of that expertise in the proposals, because, our contractor first figures out what the granting agency wants. Trying to do that up in Tallahassee sometimes is really hard because the House and the Senate sometimes don't want the same things, but we have been very, very successful, so that's an important one. And as it relates to projects, and I know you're at this point probably now, you cannot brag enough about success stories. Public wants to see movement. The public wants to see action. They want to see, oysters going in the ground. And so it's really important to communicate, the things that are going on at a level where you are talking about value contribution. And our first annual report, which was done 100% in-house, we're getting ready to rebrand this week, got us closer to where I want to see it. But, this ability to communicate progress and value is an art form that often requires some consulting support. And getting it down so you're not looking like scientists, it's not all full of, jargon. What is the simple value proposition of putting, live oysters, or shell in a shuck and share program into the ground? And so communication and reporting is key. The surprise for us, and this is something that you all can think about as you're moving through this next decade. So I said we saw this transformation of local government participation with this sphere. What we didn't anticipate was that some of these local governments were just going to say, we're going to take charge of our own future. Brevard County put a half-cent sales tax referendum on the November ballot. It was going to generate $300 million over 10 years. It passed at like 61, 62%. And now we've got a county that has a Save Our Lagoon program that's focused on really turn dirt projects. They're looking at septic to sewer conversion, stormwater conversion, oyster reef restoration, and then living shorelines, along with muck removal, muck dredging. And this is the first round, and you can't read this, but I wanted to just kind of hit you with there's a lot of projects. They said, let's not wait until year one. The money's coming in because it was a half-cent sales tax. They put in oversight committees of citizens appointed by the county commission, and now they're generating $30 million a year, and they just advanced, over 20 projects to start projects immediately. Whether it's planning or implementation, they hit the ground running. So I keep thinking, imagine an NEP with 5 counties with local dollars matching state, matching federal. And you see at the legislature right now, there is no surprise in my mind that you're seeing both the governor's budget and many of the agency budgets really looking at cost share, but with the idea that, cost share from the state, when it's covered with local 50-50 match, that becomes a really powerful movement for a program. So for the next 10 years, $30 million a year in one county just for Indian River Lagoon restoration. It's pretty incredible. But we are still part of the glue that holds that together. And I don't know how many presentations I made in support of that, but we are working literally on a daily basis in coordination with all 5 counties. But now with Brevard, it's, you're looking at significant input.
Good.
I was going to ask you, Daryl, maybe for just some comments I've heard from people that are here today, to do like a very short, real quick, like what exactly are we talking about here as far as the estuary program? There's folks in there interested, but don't necessarily know like who's all present here, what we're all, there's different groups trying to get this estuary-like program.
Hey, Daryl, why don't you let me run through the deck real quick?
Sure.
And then we can, that is really why we're here, but, I wanted to give you a context, and we can open this up and actually have a full discussion, because that next step is really where you're at. What is it going to look like? How are you going to structure it? What are the considerations that you individually and collectively need to make? So if you don't mind, I'll just knock this out and then we'll open this up and we'll have enough time for just an open discussion. So we've got, our next step for us is this comprehensive conservation management plan. Our last one was 2008. It's not really a plan. It's like a big picture of things that you needed to do. There were 22 action issues. And so literally our plan is going to emerge. And we had to ask the question, how do you actually do this in today's world, where turn dirt is the name of the game? So we're already assembling projects. We took these 22 action plans and we're basically starting from scratch on a brand new approach, very much like the comprehensive Everglades plan. It's chapterized, it's storied, but we asked our friends at EPA, and I wanted to show you this, the power of your partners at state and federal agencies. We said, we want to see how everybody's doing it, and the EPA provided this very complicated structure. So everything in red is something that the NEP for the Indian River Lagoon didn't do that our 27 other partners looked at. And each of the 28 NEPs got one of these custom made to see where we were differing from our 27 other counterparts. And so we are now in a full CCMP revision. It's going to take every bit of 18 months. But the idea is that once we obligate under the EPA Section 320, that becomes a pretty big, complicated document. And we're going to try to take that to county by county actions. So what does Brevard County need to do under this plan? What are the obligations? What do the cities need to do? How do you cross-step that into comprehensive management planning, which very often can either be an assist or an impediment to moving forward? And we're seeing that on our coast with living shorelines, where some of the comp plan language makes it almost impossible not to go to concrete bulkhead, when a living shoreline is not only, in some cases, cheaper, it's way better. And so we're having to address those issues. So this gets into the meat of the matter, and I'm going to share just a few thoughts, and then we'll open this up. The first is you have to make a decision first about your estuary programs. What's the structure? And there is no perfect world in this. You can take an existing structure, whether it's a regional planning council, a university, an economic development council, whatever that structure is, and you can house your new estuary program within an existing organization. The benefits of that, of course, is that you are going to hopefully get some strategic benefits of the capacity of that organization. But the significant negative of that is how do you maintain autonomy and also your brand identity if you're nested within another agency? And we saw that with the NEP. 25 years in the Water Management District, the NEP was always viewed as a Water Management District project. It was never viewed as a program. And so you have to make that choice. Even though there was great synergies and tremendous in-kind support from the district, our decision was to go independent because we felt that was a better model to get distributed leadership. The other side of this coin is independent fresh start. You could do a non-government entity, 501c3 if you wanted to do political campaigning. It could be a C4. But whatever structure you do in the nonprofit world, you need to ask the questions, will you have the capacity to acquire, the state and federal dollars? How do you work best with your intergovernmental agencies, many of which feel more comfortable working government agency to government agency rather than government agency to private sector? And that sounds like a small impediment, but it actually is not. That there are just some similarities, especially in the way dollars get reviewed, the transparency. There's just some consistency there. If you get a nonprofit, and we're even having that now, you don't want to compete with your other nonprofits for money. And so you need to be thinking about where you fit within your community. And then what we did was the independent special district. And of course, there is very clear guidance for that, both in a number of statutes. Statute 189 is the one that covers most of the detail of independent special sections, districts, I mean. But the key is that you got to get there. And so if you look at the timeline, Janet, of kind of when the council first said, let's be a special district, they were a full year getting that special district set up. 2014 to 2015 was all about the legal obligations, the paperwork of the interlocal agreement. You know, with 8 different agencies, that meant that interlocal had to go to 8 different bodies for full review, legal review, and then county commission, you know, or water management district governing board support. So there's a timeline that, you know, you can't start this soon enough, because setting up a special district is challenging and there are a lot of statutory requirements. But it does provide some unique opportunities if you write your bylaws and your protocols properly. And so I am allowed, by the way they set the district up and their discussions about procedures, to lobby. Now, I can't lobby using Section 320 money, ever. So the federal dollar is really tight about that. So my salary is coming from the local the local government contribution. And it allows me to fundraise. It allows me to have discussions in Tallahassee. 3 weeks I'm going to Washington, and I don't need to worry, you know, about some of those federal, you know, restrictions. But each one of these needs to be set up very carefully based on how you want the business to be structured. I almost didn't take this job because of one clause in the interlocal that I really had to think about. They had a sunset clause that every 5 years that they are going to review whether they want to continue this interlocal. And for me, as an executive director, if I wanted to give $1 million to this program from the private sector, that would bother me, because I want to know that there's stability in the organization that I'm taking my private dollars to, and that there isn't the likelihood that some political whim that an organization can be terminated, even though the expectation and the anticipation was a long-term commitment. And I got over it by saying, you know what? Any one of these governmental agencies cannot fund at will. You know, right now we're not sure about some of our funding at the state. We're really not sure about EPA. And so I said, okay, as much as I didn't like that clause, I'm still taking this job, you know, knowing that the likelihood of a successful program being terminated is 0. So the burden is making sure that each of your partners sees the value of the program. So you need to decide that, and that's a really big decision point that we can talk about. Yes?
Do you know why that was in there?
Yes, I do. Because I asked the attorney about that on my way up to Tallahassee 2 days ago. Guys, I didn't, you know, I had my attorney look at it. The current mindset politically, and it's a pervasive mindset, is, you know, don't expand government. Don't expand, you know, government programs that are like long-lasting. You know, so if you have a project, do a project. I'm going to argue, and will argue on the record anytime, that there are certain programs that need to be long-term, that are the basic foundations of healthy communities. So communities don't stop doing economic development even when the economy is good, and you double down when the economy is bad. Florida never stops tourism development. And I know you don't up here. I see it everywhere. You are constantly, because you know that those discretionary dollars could go anywhere in the world, and if you want them up here in the Panhandle, then you're going to have to advertise. That is something you know that is a stable delivery system of a governance structure for a community. We know that we have to do maintenance and management on our built infrastructure. Sometimes we don't do it. We kick that can down the road at a cost. But we know that eventually roads need to be improved. Schools need to be improved. You know, infrastructure needs to be improved. Water and clean water and coastal estuaries are that part of the infrastructure. So part of what we need to be talking about in the larger context of this is that this is not a short-term game. This is a long-term, you know, commitment to to quality of community. And when you stop making it, you will start going in a direction that ultimately you won't want to go. And these thoughts, and there's only 10 of them and they're fast, are just thoughts I want you to think about, because they are thoughts that I think about and have been for the last 15 months. First is getting the right players in the room and keeping them in the room. I see a lot of people who scream from the sidelines saying we want change, but as soon as you ask for a volunteer, you're down to 4 or 5 people. So there's a value to having a larger constituency of support, because within that constituency, there's only going to be a small portion who are going to be the people driving the leadership positions. You want to make sure they're the right people at multiple levels, federal, state, local, but especially the communities. Who are the citizens who are going to help drive the connection to community? There's a body of science, social science, which I really embrace because it tells the story of the challenges of what we do. And it's called network governance. And so if we all were a network governance entity, we've got, let's say, cities, we have counties, we have state representatives, we have maybe federal agencies in the room. Each of you representing your agency has a different set of authorities, a different set of responsibilities, and in some cases, a different set of priorities. How do we bring us together? How do we bring us together if you've got a county in the room who's actually suing the state, for some regulation that got passed? And the way network governance works best is that you bring those leaders into an environment where you can still represent your constituency, but you're in the room to represent the whole as well. And that we know we're going to be fighting. We know there's going to be some, stuff that we'll never agree on. Septic to sewer is going to, when we get down to the details of converting septic to sewer in Florida, and those of you who are in local government know how challenging those dollars are. And there's going to be some rubbing. There's going to be some challenges about where do you start, how much do you spend, but you have to have a place to do that where you let the best available science and economic data drive decisions, and estuary program is that place. And in fact, it's the only place you will get network governance. You can't get it within an agency. You can't get it within a municipality. You have to get it within an organizational structure that embraces the fact that, we've got different ideas about stuff. And then if we can agree on 80% and move that, we have progress. I've added a graph here, which was Trisect. The company's no longer actually consulting. They've all gone on different ways. But in working with them, with myregion.org through the Florida High-Tech Corridor about 10 years ago, they had a vision for how this works best. And that is that you need to have process, but you have to have right people. And right people isn't just about individuals. You need to have diversity, and you need to have representatives from government, the private sector, and the independent sector equally represented. If you miss any of those sectors, you're not going to get to your goal. And the idea is that you're working across boundaries, that in this room, if we were in an estuary program, you can represent your constituency, but in here the boundaries and those constituency bars come down so we can have a larger discussion about the future of an estuary that we all share that impacts us all equally. And it recognizes that none of us have enough clout or money or people or even intelligence. So to solve those problems alone, then we want to bring as many people into the room to help us get there. Don't reinvent the wheel. You've got all sorts of opportunities to just take what's out there and embrace what you want and throw out what you don't. I did not embrace this graph in the beginning of my 5-year program evaluation. I kind of think I'm a pretty smart guy, PhD notwithstanding. I probably would have been better being a surfboard maker. But as I worked through that 90-day program evaluation, I went, gosh, there's a bunch of stuff in this throughput diagram that I want, because it's clear path to success. What are your outputs? What are your outcomes? What do they look like short term, medium term, long term? And so grab what you can. You don't need to own it all, but make sure you're looking around. Don't try to start this all on your own. Bring in the National Estuarine Research Reserves. You're bringing me in. You have DEP in the room, the water management districts. Get that advice and then make your own program with the best stuff that you possibly can. I've spent most of my career trying to dumb down science because I've never really understood scientists, even though I am one. The fact is, I look at how we communicate science on a national level and think we've just done it badly. We're really smart, but we do a bad job of coming and telling you why our science is valuable, what it means, getting it down to basics. And we have, I think, found a pathway in the Indian River Lagoon, thanks to Brevard County, who had to pass that half-cent sales tax. And we have taken all of the projects that would represent a comprehensive restoration plan and put them into the R, as we call it. What do you need to reduce? What do you need to remove? Where do you need and what do you need to restore? How do you respond to changes in a system? What do you need to rebuild, which is way different than restoring? An infrastructure, you don't restore a wastewater treatment plant. You're going to either improve it or you're going to put a new advanced treatment plant in. Research, how do you do research? I know there are a lot of entities now that stop using that word because they think it's not politically correct. We should not shy away from the need for continuing scientific and economic research to show us the best path forward. And then reporting the community. So thinking about the language of how we speak and share success. And also speaking about the dollars. I'm going to show you just two because they're profoundly important when I do my work, both on the Hill in Tallahassee. Florida Ocean Alliance did an economic study back in 2013. And our coastal and ocean economic cluster, the industry clusters all combined to be valued at about $584 billion a year. And we're one of the biggest industries in the state of Florida. Now, tourism is embedded, marine industries, oil and gas, but the fact is we shouldn't have to be constantly arguing that, for $1 million or $2 million for this industry sector, coastal communities, because we're driving Florida's economy. And I've always wondered what the return on investment value would be. And in fact, we got two reports over this last year in Brevard County. One was done by Brevard itself to support their plan, and they had the economic value of the Indian River Lagoon around $6+ billion with a 20-to-1 return on investment. Every dollar spent was either going to protect a resource value or expand it, 20-to-1. And I actually sat down with the economist and did a review and thought, God, I'm not believing this. In industry, if you get 8, 10-to-1, that's like super high. And then the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council and East Central Florida came out with this document done in a completely different methodology. And they had $7.6 billion and 33-to-1 return on investment value. Now, this isn't cash, so don't confuse this with I invested $1 and I'm getting $33 back. This is I'm investing $1 and I'm protecting and returning $33 back. So some of it is value that you're protecting already in the system and value that's going to be generated in expansion of the system. We need to understand in that economic context, and I think this is part of what your discussions will be down the line. Do you look at septic to sewer conversion or a living reef, with restore dollars? Doesn't matter. If you have capital improvements, eventually you're going to need to do maintenance on them. And kicking the can down on wastewater maintenance is really bad for the water business. And we've done that throughout the state of Florida. And so we're going to need to think about what 21st century infrastructure means and how to maintain it, especially when we start looking at the infrastructure of what I call the cash flow of restoration, the monitoring. Knowing where you are, whether your projects have improved the condition, the trend line of that condition means we need recurring, and let me say that again, recurring stable revenues for monitoring statewide in estuaries and coastal waters. And we're not close to having that commitment yet, but we need to make a case. This is about infrastructure. And this is what we're preparing for. This is just new from Florida Chamber Foundation. 6 additional million residents, by 2030, 150 million visitors, 2 million additional jobs are needed to remain at 5% unemployment, that's a big order, especially when we're still in the negative in places like the Panhandle on job growth. We're going to have 5 million new drivers. Imagine that on our roads. And so we're not talking about these decisions, being decisions to get us where we need to be today. These are decisions that need to get us prepared for what's about to come. And the last couple is that environment does not work in a vacuum. Science doesn't work in a vacuum. I think your biggest opportunity, maybe one of the biggest opportunities in America, because of the catastrophic oil spill, which we wish hadn't happened, but the fact that you have these discretionary dollars now to kind of make right, some of that damage done. If you think about this in the broadest context of value proposition, as it relates to the Gulf of Mexico, these coastal estuaries in your communities, I think this could be one of those historic moments for the Gulf of Mexico counties and clearly the states if we get it right. So it's not to put any pressure on you guys, but I think you have a unique moment in history to do something that very few have. And we've talked about this already. Science does not operate in a vacuum. The social and economic context of community, the vision of each community, you don't need to homogenize each of these cities or the counties. They can all maintain their unique identity as assets along a shared resource asset, which is the Gulf of Mexico. I wanted to just show you this because we started to create an alliance, which now is the 4 national estuaries. So Sarasota Bay, Tampa Bay, Charlotte Harbor, and Indian River Lagoon have just signed a memorandum of agreement that we would work closer together, even though we do anyway. But when you start thinking about the National Estuarine Research Reserves, what you're about to do here, over 40 aquatic preserves, if you start adding those watersheds together, and this is just the 9 estuaries already recognized nationally, it's a good part of Florida. This coastal discussion is about coastal Florida, which is all of Florida, including Orlando. That, we are in a peninsula, and we need to start thinking about that water context together. And we need to change our language. Water is not just an environmental issue, it's an infrastructure issue. And that's the discussion on the Hill right now in Washington and also in Tallahassee. So I'll leave you with just this last 2. We're in this for the long haul, and so are you. So look to all of us out here in the community for support. We're all cheering you on. We'll help you in any way we can. There's a depth of knowledge within the National Estuary Program, 28 different estuaries with programs, all with creative, really innovative staff. Utilize that network. And remember that water, for us in Florida, water's never going away. This is going to be an issue today and for the future. And we need to get it right now before we're dealing with this next 6 million people. And I like to share this partly because he's such a good guy and such a visionary, but Dick Nunes, who's a dear friend of mine, former chairman of the board at the Walt Disney Company, investor in water technology companies. He's in his 80s, but he constantly reminds me about the blue sky dream. Of course, he's talking about Disney, but the idea that you can set a real high bar, and then if you have a plan and execute the plan, then you are going to reach whatever that aspirational end game is. And Dick actually has a vision for Florida. And his vision is that we look at water and water restoration and ecosystem stewardship the same way we looked at space back in the 60s. That if we bring connected leadership together with the idea that we would be the first clean water state in the nation, the first state that didn't have any water body that didn't meet its intended needs, that didn't need a TMDL, that would set us on a trajectory for success way beyond just the environmental consideration. But imagine what that does in the context of a global community, including generating the technology that we would export, like we did with space and aviation, to the rest of the world. So we've got the problems, but we have the skill sets to solve them. Let's solve them domestically, locally, and then export. And then he always asked me, he said, well, Dwayne, what's your big vision? And I'm not Dick Nunes. And so I go, my vision is I want to be eating clams, oysters, and crabs that are locally caught, locally distributed, and locally consumed without having to worry about the health of that food source. And I'd love to see a sustainable commercial fishery again in those areas, because that's the high bar. That if we can get the ecosystems healthy enough to sustain a sustainable commercial fishery, then you will also get swimmable, fishable, you get all of it. And so for me, that's kind of the end game for the NEP, getting those commercial fisheries back. So with that, we'll just open up for a full round robin. It's always been a pleasure to come up here, and I appreciate the invitation. And I know you guys have some questions, so let's open it up. I want to go back to this discussion about the next steps, because I think that's kind of where you're at, and that's what I heard yesterday at the meetings. So, Darryl?
So, Shelley.
Could you explain about the county that didn't really embrace the program and what drove them to now sign up for it?
Sure. Well, the county was Indian River County. In fact, one of their commissioners was one of the founding commissioners on that county coalition. And that individual, and I was not there, so I'm just telling you what I've gleaned from minutes that I've read, felt that standing up a new layer of state government was ideologically the wrong place to go, that it was just another layer of bureaucracy, and that the local communities can and should handle this issue. That they worry about the county issues, that portion of the Indian River Lagoon on the county, and that they were doing a lot of good work. And so it was very much a philosophical issue about expanding government. And there were some procedural things that the individual took issue with. 3 cities, Vero Beach, Fellsmere, and where we have our offices, Sebastian said, we need to be in the game. And so they came on board representing those 3 cities for the county. Fast forward 15 months, and after an election, the county voted 3-2 just a few months ago to join the interlocal. That commissioner is still a no vote. In fact, it was 3-2, so it was a pretty contentious discussion and vote. My position is you really need to have them at the table, and I've talked to at least one of those 2 no votes just recently and said, we'll work for your trust. They may not like the structure, but the door's open and we're already out the door moving forward, and having them on board is an important addition. That county's doing really good work. They've already taken a portion of their discretionary sales tax to look at, water issues, but it does complete what I would call the balance on council. But you have to respect the value of home rule, the ability of dissension, and discussion. And so they're coming on board, and we'll work to try to make them proud that they're on board.
Anybody else have a question right now? If not, I'll
go back to the moment 15 months ago, and you mentioned you were trying to lay out this whole administrative structure, the conference, and all the pieces of that. At the same time, you walked into the job in a crisis moment. How did you manage the probably strong desire of everyone you talked to about acting immediately, dealing with the problems that were very much evidence around the lagoon, with the careful building of the structure you were going to ultimately have govern this?
I don't know that I'd use the word manage. We reacted to urgent need. And so, we were getting dozens and dozens of phone calls, I don't know how many press conferences, and public meetings I went to. We just took it one step at a time. Try not to get, too, emotionally engaged in the immediacy of that bloom, because it wasn't going away. I mean, it was clear we were going to be in that bloom condition for a long haul. And so we really did three things. We said, let's respond to the public need first. So when we had a citizen call up, we didn't say, oh, we're too busy working on our administrative structure. We just served the people. And we'd stop all of that administrative stuff to do whatever we needed to do within the community to make sure that the community understood the scientific basis of what was going on. So providing facts in what was more than a hysterical moment. It was a moment of, real serious threat to communities, that we just put ourselves in a service mode and said, whatever we get asked to do, we're doing, and we'll provide the best service we can, and everything else takes a back seat to that. But we still had to do the business. Our council was meeting monthly at the time, and you can imagine in the public sector having to do minutes every month, set up the room every month. I mean, so we were, just handling just the council. And so we kind of just incrementally looked at service first, anything that we could do that would have an impact on lagoon water quality was second. So, handling that crisis, then making sure projects were moving forward that were going to solve the problem. And then we put the administrative stuff kind of in the back end. And because I had such good staff, I don't know that, that we were far behind where we would have been had we not had the crisis, but we worked 7 days a week for many, many months, in full emergency mode. And, it's the nature of an estuary program that's this big.
So, first off, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
So the opportunity we have in front of us is EPA will be releasing an RFP supposedly by the end of this month, knocking on wood. And what they're going to be requesting is for each of the watersheds in the Panhandle, from Perdido River over to Apalachicola River, to submit proposals for why they should be the first estuary program. EPA has $2 million to give to a watershed to create an estuary program. Now, it won't be a national estuary program, and you have the congressional delegation and have the annual funding that the entities used to get, hopefully will continue to get. So the $2 million is to stand up a program and then to develop and adopt the CCMP, which is the plan. And then that $2 million runs out. And so what they're hoping is that this will be seed money to establish a new program that looks and operates like a national estuary program does, using that model, but it just wouldn't have that congressional delegation and long-term funding. Now, what we're excited about is this is an opportunity for the Panhandle to do exactly what we've been talking about all morning, which is come together as a community, bringing federal, state, and local governments together, citizens, universities, citizen organizations, to come together and develop a plan on what are our biggest issues that we're facing, what are the projects and ranking priority that will have the biggest impact addressing those, and so that our water bodies don't get into crisis mode. Like I mentioned earlier, back when I was a kid, we were in crisis mode. We had fish kills every year. I literally would skip calculus at UWF and go canoeing, and that was before Gulf Power had the new emission controls on the power plant, and my throat would literally burn from when I put it in the body, toxic body, I guess. It would burn, because that sulfur in the air would mix with my water in my throat and it becomes sulfuric acid. And that doesn't happen anymore. We don't have fish kills near as often as we used to. But we have an opportunity here with a lot of money coming to make sure that we identify how do we best spend that money to have the greatest legacy for our communities. And so that's what this is all about. And that's why we've been really lucky to have Wayne come up and A couple of years ago, we had Holly Greening from Tampa Bay and Roberta Swan from Mobile Bay, NEPs. And if you want another example of why this program is so exciting and successful, Tampa Bay set out as their goal to restore their seagrass coverage to pre-development acreage. Now, that's a pretty significant goal. They met that goal, I believe it was in 2005, 5 years ahead of schedule. And they didn't do that through going out and planting more seagrass. They did that using science to say, what's driving the decline? What can we do? And what are the projects that will have the greatest impact on getting that seagrass back? And they implemented it. They found the funding, they did the projects, and they got the results. And that's what we have the opportunity to do. Our water bodies are much better than they used to be. We don't have a big red, target shining on us right now that we're aware of. But this is an opportunity to be more effective and work together to achieve a greater outcome and not have the kind of environmental catastrophe that happened in Indian River Lagoon if we're smart and work together. And so again, I think this is a huge opportunity. It's very important that I believe the Panhandle embrace this and try to get these programs on the ground and successful because of the opportunity that we have for not only the rest of my life and our lives, but our kids and their kids. If we do this right, we won't have to have my grandson see those kind of fish kills, unless it's a cold snap. So that's the opportunity. And then we've submitted a request, as have several counties, to create hopefully a second and a third estuary program out of the Earth Water Quality, which all your federal agencies see every one of them. So hopefully we can get those funded as well. So we actually might get 2 or 3 funded, which would be huge to have the entire, that's my plug, you guys are sitting here now. So that's my spill. I think is that kind of.
Yes, I just knew that there were some citizens here that have been on
Right.
emails and all of these meetings before, so thank you.
So on that note, I have a couple, unless someone have a question? Because I have a couple, yeah, Jan?
I just wanted to make a comment, and Wayne alluded to it, is sort of in the budget politics, both at the state and federal level. It's really hard to sustain continual funding, and particularly it's really difficult for infrastructure projects. And so, one of the advantages of this to me is it creates this opportunity to sort of be nimble and chase the money where it is and really be responsible for it locally as opposed to being dependent on the whims of what goes on in the federal and state level. I think it puts you more in the driver's seat.
I think that's a really good comment and also a good opportunity for you all because you've got the seed money from Restore. My recommendation is, look beyond the projects, that funding mechanism, and leverage this moment while you do have that revenue stream and you'll have startup funds to think about not just the traditional routes of funding, but the non-traditional routes that may, and I think they're going to start to arise. The good news that I'm hearing from Washington is that the House of Representatives have created a National Estuary Caucus. It is being supported by both parties. My understanding that we have well over 50 House members that have signed that caucus. A letter was just distributed from that caucus to appropriations, making a really strong case for support of not just the National Estuary Program, but they make a value case. Now, we're not the only ones, though, that are fighting, potential federal reductions. Sea Grant, 50-year program. Don't quote me on this, but the last number I saw was for every dollar that Sea Grant gets federally, it's leveraged out over $120. And the National Estuarine Research Reserve. So we're at a moment where we're having to prove value. And having come from industry, I get a little less excited, and emotional when this happens because what we're being asked to do is to demonstrate contributed value. And yes, it's scary to think that you might get zeroed out, but I still have faith that, the system, the way it's set up, the Senate, the House, and the fact that so much of this is local, so these congressional delegates represent you all in the community. And I think that this discussion will head down a line where there may be some cuts, but I don't know that they're going to be as dramatic as at least some expect right now. But it does mean that you as a community need to be sending a message, really clear message that, you know, federal investment in coastal programs is good business. And that, you know, you especially, we talked about this a bit yesterday, but, you know, decreases in NOAA, decreases in EPA, potentially could slow the process of restore projects, because you're going to need to do permitting. You're going to need to have these projects going through Corps of Engineers, through Marine Mammal Protection, you know, through NIMS. And so these are connected issues that sometimes I think elected officials, they press on the balloon over here and forget that it's going to push out over here. They just need to know that this is important. And I'm at least guardedly optimistic that at least the NEP program stays in business. We're going up in 3 weeks to have that conversation.
Yes, sir.
It's pretty late in the game to reply to RFP, so is there any action already underway that's
Yes.
meeting and whatever to get that going, or what?
Yes, sir. So the RFP actually was going to come out, I think, maybe 6 months ago was when they originally anticipated getting it out. So we've actually been having meetings in each of the watersheds. So Rio and Pensacola have come together to propose a program for Rio, Pensacola Bay as an estuary program. Chalkhatchee Bay, Okaloosa, Walton County have been very active building alliances. They went up to Washington and Holmes County, have resolutions for those two counties, a bunch of the cities. And so in Bay County, same thing, we've been building coalitions there as well. Jim Muller is taking the lead over there, working with Ward Yeager from Gulf County. So we've actually been having the conversations for maybe 2 years now about creating these programs. And the money is now starting to become a reality. The RFP, when it comes out, will say, okay, communities, tell us why it should be you. And so that's the importance of bringing Dwayne, and that was about a year and a half ago, we had Holly and Roberta come over and talk about those two programs. So I don't think it's late in the game. This is just another opportunity to get more informed about how the NEPs operate, and I was really excited to get Dwayne up because they've just gone through the reorganization. And so he's gone through what we will be going through to stand up the programs and thinking through the issues of who should be our host and what should the management organization look like. And so we've had input from 3 now, and the conversation will continue. It was a great question. Anybody else have a question? I have another follow-up that I wanted to.
I got a question for you. Who actually is going to do the RFP? Is that being issued through EPA?
Through EPA.
Will they use the same kind of lens and criteria that they did with the National Estuary Program? Is it the same protocol basically and criteria base?
Yes.
Yeah, we'd be guessing because
I've asked for drafts and they haven't provided any draft, so we don't know. We assume that instance.
Well, if you look at when they asked the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council for the money, they crafted their request very much along the guidelines of the National Estuary Program.
So my recommendation would be, if you're working on those proposals, then is, first and foremost is the ecological. You got to make a case for ecological value, and so the science of that is really, really important. But now that I'm, working with EPA directly, you cannot understate the commitment of the EPA for these programs to be consensus-driven, non-regulatory, and community-based. I mean, that is really, really important. It is really the one thing that differentiates our program from maybe any in the nation is that local empowerment and leadership is so critical. And so being able to demonstrate not just structure, but making sure you have that you've thought through that host structure and the functional relationships of partners DEP, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who are the players that are likely to be at the table? I think that's going to be important as well. And then it couldn't hurt to think a little bit about, even though you've got a 5-year timeline on this?
It's really output based, so the $2 million will go to standing up the organization and then developing and adopting the CCMP. And that, in what you look at, that is what they're sort of tying the money to. So I think they estimated 3 to 5 years is what they had in their language.
Yeah, CCMPs are every bit, once you've stood up the whole system, I've been told 24 months to 3 years. We just simply don't have time for that. We're going to try to do our revision in 18 months, and I don't know if we'll make it, but we'll get there. So, having some consideration for what happens beyond that, I think would be important. Because the last thing you all want to do is to take this investment dollar, the seed money, wind up generating this incredible coalition, get to a comprehensive conservation management plan, and then you go, okay, we're out of money. Now what? How do you sustain that cultural, structural component to do the stewardship? Because really the rubber hits the road after the CCMP. That's where, all the work and actually the fun starts in the actual restoration implementation, and then moving through that as your community grows. And so, having some thought, I don't know how EPA is going to review this, but, in my mind, I could see somebody up there, because they have really good scientists, thinking, so what happens after? And who's going to implement, and what keeps them together?
And we're in a good spot too, because we also have the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund is funding the update of our swim plans, which will be really a central component of our estuary program plan. And, around here, people are very outcome driven. They don't want another plan. So I think that's why, as we go through the process of building the coalition and a larger plan, we also have to have some pilot projects going so we can point to successes as we go along. So at the end isn't, oh, we've got this great plan, but we've got this plan, we want to go forward and here's some examples of what have happened and what we want to continue. Because we have to have the buy-in from the local government for continued support.
No, you're absolutely right there. I say this a lot because I get that, do we really need to spend time on another plan? And I go, well, we have almost 40 projects underway, and we're not even through our second year. And they go, oh, so yeah, you don't want to, kind of wait on everything for the plan to get done. Right. But the plan as it relates to projects, that's super critical. And so yeah, you're right, Jim. You've got to be able to show low-hanging fruit early, just to keep the engagement. And it's nothing better than taking a congressman out on a newly built oyster reef. And then they get it.
I mean, one thing that's a challenge and an opportunity with developing a program in the Panhandle is different, is there isn't an imminent crisis, and sort of picking or being able to communicate to the public what the restoration goals are. So, I mean, I liked your discussion about the Indian River Lagoon, and your goal was, to have commercial seafood harvesting. So that's something that I think is a challenge for developing these programs, that you have to pick some clear examples that resonate with the public, that you can show how the projects would lead to that.
And the connection, it's been a long time since I've been up here. I was trying to think back on how many years, but the growth on the Panhandle has just kind of blew me away a little bit. So, I was kind of remembering, 18 years ago. And so if you imagine, what the communities look like, in the context of restore and coastal restoration, I think, reaching a little bit out beyond just the environmental context of this could be valuable for all of you. We're starting to do that now in Brevard a little bit and through the other counties, but they all see the world a little differently. But you're right, when things are going good, people start paying attention to soccer games and baseball and not the dirty water. And the lesson from us is, you know, you can't take your eye off these estuaries because, you know, a lot of times if you do, you're going to wind up in a place that's going to take you way more money and time to get back to where you were because you took your eye off the ball. And it's really good to be doing this, actually, when you don't have a crisis.
Right, exactly.
Because you can do it right. And so this is what I saw. It shocks me a little. And I don't know if this is your communities or not. 45 cities. Talk to the League of Cities. I'm trying to get to each one. And I ask, do you have a vision plan for the city? I mean, is there a plan? Like, what does Brevard County as a county or Oak Hill want to be in 2030? And the answer is almost universally no. And so some of this envisioning the future, I think, could be useful as part of the CCMP. You know, how does it fit in the context with roads? And if you get a chance, you can look on myregion.org. I think all the data is still up. We did this for 7 counties along the Florida high-tech corridor. We think we spent about $2.5 million in research. And the interesting thing was that when we finally got to the end of it, we were almost all in agreement that, and we call it the 4 C's, that you wanted to have countryside, so agricultural land and rural lands. You wanted to have conservation. You wanted to have corridors, so connections between communities and people. And you wanted to have developments that weren't urban sprawl developments, but they were more cluster, where you could work and live and hike and bike your, you know, favorite lake or the ocean and still maybe bicycle to work. And it was funny, we hit the recession and the wheels fell off that as a document, but a lot of that has been embedded in those counties' comp plans now. And so some of this has got to track over to community planning in general. And a lot of times we don't do that well in the environment. We kind of focus just on that water body, forget about what's going on around it. So I think that's an opportunity for you all. Because I can't imagine that your growth isn't going to be some of the fastest growth in Florida, you know, right up here. You got all the assets, you know. Joe?
I want to go back to the commercial fisheries aspect. In the Pensacola Bay system, and I'm sure you've heard about our fish hatchery. And one of the things that I've come in some of my assessment of that is when they released the fish in Brevard County in certain areas, they didn't know where the fish went to. There was no recapturing of them, and one of the things they determined was there was not enough habitat to support the nursery. And so they are coming up into the Panhandle to do an assessment of our estuary that has never been done by the Fish and Wildlife Commission to establish a mapping of the habitat of all the fisheries to make sure that when they start the nursery hatchery program of releasing fish, redfish, trout and such, that we have the amount of habitat available for this fishes. And I was just wondering, how have you interacted with the Fish and Wildlife Commission and this commercial fisheries vision that you have?
No, I think it's a good vision. I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you know, the vision for hatcheries was maybe bigger and more encompassing than it is today, you know, partly because of the recession. You know, hatcheries, you know, that's the last stop. I mean, if you don't have good water quality, you don't have good habitat, you lose your fisheries. When you have to start growing stuff to restore, you know, you're already behind the curve. But in some cases, that is the only way you're going to get there. And I would not have said this even 5 years ago. I'm convinced that in the Indian River Lagoon, at least, that we are going to have to be growing seagrasses at some level to accelerate the response. You know, right now we're seeing some seagrass come back, but you know, in these small windows of clear water during the winter, the recruitment is so much less than what I would have imagined had I not seen this. And so we're asking the question now is, kind of how do you build that infrastructure capacity and then make it work? So we just did a replanting of seagrasses where actually we had to take grasses out of the Indian River Lagoon. They went over to Holly in Tampa Bay, They grew them up in the nursery at Tampa Bay, and then we brought them back because you're not allowed to transplant, stock from another location into yours for a lot of good biological concern reasons. So I think there's an opportunity, and this is one of those synergies. So if we begin to look at the infrastructure of restoration, living shorelines, fish stock enhancement where it's at least anticipated and needed, and we know we're going to be having to restock oysters and clams. No question, that's going to be an aquaculture, opportunity. We probably going to have to do seagrasses. You got living shorelines. I asked the question because Brevard County, in their plan over the next 10 years, they plan to restore 2 miles of oyster reef every year for 10 years. Think about that, 20 miles of oyster reef. So I asked the question, God, do we have the capacity to even do that? Do we have enough oyster shell? What it's going to look like. Nature Conservancy has done some amazing work, Charlotte Harbor, about how do you locate, what's the science that tells you, where, you have data from old oyster reefs where they were, and how do you identify the proper habitat for restoration? And so I've got a team of engineers at Northrop Grumman that are doing the supply chain analysis right now, which they're not biologists, so it's been fun to watch. They're getting master's degrees at UF, and I get a call every night, some biology question. I said, forget about the biology. I just want to know, how many shells are we talking about? Is it 1 trillion? And what's the market opportunity with shuck and share and restaurants? Can we get there? And if we can't, what's the additional cost if we have to buy shell from somewhere else? So here's my cautionary note. There's never going to be a perfect moment for restoration. And as scientists, we would love to tell you, wait till the water gets right. Wait till the habitat gets right. Don't waste your money trying to put fish into a habitat where you may not have enough habitat. And I think that is all absolutely correct, but we're going to need to take some risk, on the edges of that and say, it's looking pretty good right now. This may fail, but let's go ahead and do it. Because you're never going to have perfect. And the system's doing this. So, yeah, I could put, oyster reef and seagrasses in it, mosquito lagoon, and if I have a bloom next year, almost lose it all. But I still have the structure. And I still have the ability for natural recruitment. And so, here's my cautionary note. How much money's coming from Restore total for Florida along the Gulf? I mean, rough numbers.
$2 billion. I think all of it.
Okay, so $2 billion. In all of those, especially the ecosystem restoration projects, some of them aren't going to work the way we think. Just steel yourself to that. And I worry that people go, oh, we just wasted our money. Like beach nourishment, we hear that a lot. Oh, that sand's just going to get rolled right out to sea on the first storm. But, we've got the Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge that has nesting densities that are historic levels, partly because they're nourishing beaches to the north, and that sand is coming south down to those areas. And so just expect there's going to be some failure in this, and get the community, used to the fact that, sometimes the end game is going to be a little different than what we anticipated on the front end of these projects. Overall, with $2 billion, you're going to see a significant, improvement, as long as you stick to good science, and good business decisions.
And I think that's part of the point here is through the estuary program, we have an opportunity to maximize that success level versus just every county sort of working individually and the agencies on just picking projects. Which is not to say they won't be good projects, but if we have a little bit more of a structure and science behind identifying what the biggest priorities are and what projects will have the greatest impact, I think we're going to raise that success chance a little bit more and have a better outcome for the community. Barbara?
So first of all, thank you for sharing all this information. It's been very informative. I have a question about your lagoon and the counties that are working with you.
great question. So back in '89, we knew we had nutrient enrichment, a trend of nutrient enrichment. We warned about this shift from submerged aquatic vegetation to microplankton. We were having problems, but here's the disconnect. We have 300,000 septic systems on the Indian River Lagoon, best estimate. We don't know how many of those septic systems are failing because there is no regulation that would force inspection of septic. And I understand this, having come from industry, I understand the cost associated with that. And I kind of understand why the business and development community, and especially real estate, are worried about those inspection issues. You know, so I get it. There's a bill that actually was proposed in Florida House, Randy Fine, who wanted to just have mandatory inspections at the sale of a home. So if I'm going to buy it's almost not an environmental issue, this is more of a disclosure issue. And the fact is, right now, I'm thinking that's not going to ever get out of the house. It's been watered down and amended. You know, we've got a long history in the state of Florida having issues with septic. And so I'm at the point now, and this is me talking personally, not on behalf of the council, that our discussion needs to change. Because we're still, Brevard County, $300 million, you know, with a good portion going to septic, I think about, I don't recall how much. A lot of it's dredging, restoration, but some of it's septic to sewer conversion, small amount. But we're still permitting septic in Brevard County at the same time we're trying to get septic out. We need to change this discussion, and I think technology is going to get us there. That there is no reason in the 21st century, in the state of Florida, with our coastal and water assets, that we should be putting any pollutants to surface or groundwater anywhere. Period. Now the question is, how do you get there in an effective and efficient manner where you don't absolutely do a catastrophic hit to growth and development? And I'm convinced that's technology. And we don't have an investment structure at a federal level, you know, or even at the state level where we kind of embrace and invest in research and development on these issues. You know, Brevard County, we're having a serious conversation about sending humans to Mars in the next 20 years. So I use this a lot. I said, how could we be having this conversation and still be talking about septic systems as an acceptable way of handling waste? I mean, I just don't get it. Or secondary treated. So the story of Tampa Bay is really a good story in two realms. Number one, the ability where they did really strong nutrient production, and some of it was regulatory. And they basically, in a 10-year period, saw this resurgence of seagrasses. Now, of course, they have good flushing. It's a different system than ours. But they doubled down and said, we are putting Tampa Bay on a dramatic nutrient diet. During Tropical Storm Hermine this past year, they had, God, I'm trying to think of the number, I think it was 155 million gallons of partially treated or raw sewage discharged to Tampa Bay as a result of infiltration or inadequacy in the wastewater treatment plant side of things, which includes, by the way, you know, any home built in the 60s is probably on Orangeburg pipe, and so that's going to be raw sewage to ground. So that's an infrastructure issue. Septic is a waste infrastructure issue. Actually, stormwater, a little more complicated, but it's an infrastructure issue. And so improving those three levels of infrastructure improves not only the community value, but even the home value. So, you know, septic, I'm hoping, while I'm still alive, becomes one of those, you know, it's not happening here things in Florida, but we're going to have to find something in between full sewer and septic, because if you're in rural communities, like some of the, you know, communities west of us, you're not getting centralized sewer because you simply don't have the density.